Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, and this is the first programme since our general election where the British people voted to elect Labour as our new government, and they won with a massive majority. And we'll be asking in this programme, what does a Labour government mean for Christian freedoms in the UK? So in this programme today, I'm joined by Helen Spiby Van, who's the Vice President of the Christian People's Alliance, together with Robert Harris, Voice for Justice. So I'll start off with you, Robert. It's great to have you both on the programme. Particularly, it's a very important programme as we really reflect and analyse the election result and the impact that this is going to have on Christian freedom. So give us an update on the excellent work that you are doing and the team at Voice for Justice UK on championing Christian freedoms in this country.
Yes, I'd be glad to. Well, I think I said on a few previous programmes, Voice for Justice commissioned an inquiry which is looking into discrimination against Christians within the UK, and we're hearing public or private testimony from Christians who say they have faced discrimination on account of their faith. So people who want to remain anonymous, we've catered for that. There's a dedicated website which gives all the testimonies that have been heard publicly, and this will be part of an investigation that CDAC will look into the question of the nature, context and scale of discrimination faced by Christians in this country. And it's anticipated, God willing, that after sitting for 2 years, the Commission will submit a report to Parliament for their consideration. And just very, very briefly, we recently published a report, The Costs of Keeping the Faith, and that looks at the results of a survey. 1,500 people responded to questions about how they experience their faith within work, online, and a whole range of other contexts. 38% of under 35s felt that their freedom of speech was restricted. There's a lot of very important findings in this report, and you can access it for free on our website.
Excellent. And Edmund did a great job on this as well, and he was on, so we did unpack it on Politics Day. Helen, good to see you. It's been a while since you've been on the programme, so it's good to see you. Do you want to give us an update on your perspective on the last 6 weeks on the campaign trail with the Christian People's Alliance? How well do you believe that your party did in the election?
Thank you so much, Simon. It's great to be back. We are so grateful for all our valiant candidates. We had 22 candidates standing, and for each one of those places where they were standing, the people there wouldn't really have a voice. The Christians would not have a voice. So I'm so proud of them. They're so courageous. Just to mention a few highlights. Lucy Bay in Barking received 449 votes, which is amazing. We had Janet Bickerdike in Leeds South, who actually, during the announcements for the candidates, when they were talking about how many votes people got, she actually went down on her knees and prayed to the Lord for the nation. And it was interesting because after they'd finished sort of reading out all the votes on the stage, Hilary Benn, who was the successful MP, went to do his victory speech, and he actually mentioned, I'm not sure if it was in response, but he did talk about how socialism is like a religion, or it's the sort of affirmative religion that he's, the better version of religion that he wanted to affirm. So, and in terms of my experiences on the street, it was absolutely fascinating meeting residents, talking on the doorstep to people. People are so supportive of our biblical values. They really are family, supporting family, pro-life. Most people, when you explain it, they really understand, you know, especially people who've been through hard times. You know, I've met people, for example, carers who have the difficult job looking after neurodiverse grown-up children, to teenagers who've been victims of knife crime. And they really affirm our values. They're relieved to hear somebody that cares about it. We have all kinds of ministry time as well. Sometimes when you talk about these sensitive topics, it does sort of precipitate some tears. We have prayers, we have encouragement as well. it's really being on the front lines of the spiritual battle standing as a candidate, and I would absolutely recommend anybody to join us. It's a wonderful opportunity to be a Christian witness at this time.
Excellent. And Robert, what is your reflex on this general election result? I mean, I think what surprised us the most was the magnitude of the Labour victory and really the complete collapse of the Conservative vote. I'm going through figures. So Labour won with a massive majority, that's 411 seats, up from 209 they got in the previous general election, but they only increased their share of the vote from 2% from the next general election. Can you break that down for us?
It's interesting, isn't it? At the first press conference that Keir Starmer gave at Downing Street, Robert Peston, the journalist, said to Keir Starmer something quite astonishing. He said that 80% of the British electorate didn't vote for him. Now, I've looked up where that figure comes from, and there's someone called Scarlett Maguire, who's a director of a polling company, who came up with that figure. Now, that figure includes not only those who voted for the other parties, but also those who didn't vote. 40% of the British electorate didn't actually vote for whatever reason. And in this election, they say it's the second lowest turnout in our electoral history since 1885. So that's quite something. I also note that the smaller parties have concerns because the share of their vote, when translated into numbers of seats, is quite problematic. So, for instance, the Green Party, they got 7% of the vote, and that translates as 4 seats. Reform UK, they got 14% of the vote, and they got 5 seats. And then you get the Liberal Democrats, who got 12% of the vote, and they got 72 seats. So those discrepancies will trigger further debates, I suspect, over the coming months and years about the possibility of proportional representation being introduced into this country. And the other thought I have is that the breakdown of MPs, I mean, there's a new record for women in Parliament. 41% of the new intake is women. And also there's 335 new MPs who have never sat in Parliament before. 300 have been returned, and the remaining, I think there's 15 remaining who had a period of absence from Parliament.
Robert, share with us some of the champions of Christian freedom that have lost in this election, that they are no longer coming back to Parliament, the likes of Fiona Bruce and others who have done a magnificent job in standing up for Christian freedom in this country.
Well, Fiona Bruce is one pro-life MP who comes to mind. Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg is another who has stood up for a lot of very important causes. There's also Miriam Cates, who has spoken out a lot in favour of protecting children, safeguarding them within the classroom. So yes, there has been a few prominent losses. Nick Fletcher. But that's what we have in a democracy. Unfortunately, people are not there forever.
Absolutely. And Helen, what did you make of the complete total collapse of the Conservative vote? Again, the Conservatives did so badly. They only won 121 seats. They are down from 244 seats from their 2019 election, where they won a total of 365 seats. Of course, Reform played a major part in eroding the Conservative vote, and that was reflected on why they lost so many seats. But of course, we've got Rees-Mogg lost his seat, Penny Mordaunt lost her seat, the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps also lost his seat as well. So it was an absolute bloodbath, wasn't it, for the Conservative Party?
Yes, absolutely terrible, and I'm still grieving some of those amazing Christians who we now lost, like Robert was just sharing. Now, when we actually dig into some of the popular vote, it helps us also to get a slightly different perspective as what's going on in the nation. So the popular vote is where they add the total national vote for a particular party, and we can see from that whether or not that reflects sort of the number of seats that they've ended up with. So for Conservatives this time they got 6 million votes, compared to 2019 where they got 14 million. So yes, it's slashed by almost 50%. The number of people who actually voted for them, this is not the number of seats, but the support across the nation, as people have really turned their backs on the Conservatives this election. But when we actually compare the Labour Party in terms of the popular vote, they got 9.7 million. So it's nowhere like the 14 million that the Tories got in the last election, and that tells you something as well. So I think what we can see from this is that it wasn't so much that people were sort of endorsing Labour, its manifesto, its policies and what it stands for, as much as they were turning away from the Conservatives. And I have a little bit of insight on this because I have a friend, an older friend, who has been in the Conservative Party for a long time. He actually selects candidates that get sent. He's on the panel for selection. And he has been saying for many years that he is frustrated with the people who the central Tory office are actually selecting. So there's an agency in the middle who kind of organises these things, and it seems to be very, very biased. So the candidates that get sent out, they get selected by a central panel, and then they get set out to be reselected, and basically they're always selecting very progressive Conservatives. And he said that by the time they come to the panel that he's on, he really can't actually choose somebody that he really wants to stand. And so this is a problem that's been growing and growing. It's almost like the whole zeitgeist of the country. The progressives are going quite far in one direction, and they're kind of a magnetic attraction for the Conservative leaders who've been in government. But a lot of the grassroots Conservative leaders, a lot of the electorate do not want to move that way. And so we've basically seen the electorate protesting, and this is the result. Unfortunately, a lot of very, very good Christians have lost the seats. So
and this explains why so many of our voters have gone to the Reform Party, and why the Reform Party has really had a huge impact on some of the reason why the Conservatives haven't won many seats. But the big question I think we need to ask in this programme, isn't it, Robert, is how will a Labour government now with a huge majority affect Christian freedoms in this country? Share with us your thoughts.
There are many issues. Where does one begin? Firstly, there's been multiple attempts in recent years for abortion legislation to be further liberalised, which would make it even easier for people to have an abortion. And what typically happens is that it's a private member's bill. I'm thinking of 1967, when the bill from David Steele, which was a private member's bill, was not officially supported by the Wilson governments of the time, but they gave it time nonetheless. So I suspect they will want to give such a bill time within Parliament, even though it won't be officially government legislation. The other thing that comes to mind, which isn't only of relevance to Christians, but every single person within this country, is euthanasia. They call it assisted dying now. That's a rebranding of language. So this puts people at risk, I should stress, even those who don't ask for the procedure to be done. That's a whole different topic for another conversation, but it puts the vulnerable at serious risk. The other things that I would talk about is there's various sets of government guidance on things like gender questioning children in schools and colleges, and that draft guidance will either be officially recognised as the final guidance by the current government, or they may choose to change it. There are some very, very good things that centre around parents and giving parents the right to be part of the process of decision making around their children if they feel that they're questioning their gender. And the whole idea of gender ideology, the government calls it a contested area, a contested theory, so it shouldn't be taught as fact. That's the government guidance. There's also RSHE draft guidance, which stands for Relationship, Sex and Health Education. That is very, very much parent-centred as it stands at the moment. It could be changed, as I say, by the government. That focuses a huge amount on parents having the right to know what their children are being educated in. Previously, there have been many schools who have withheld the resources from parents, even though they had a right to see them. Again, the gender ideology as a contested area should not be taught. This is the government's advice within schools. And children should be known by their biological legal sex. So this gives children, when they become adults, to do what they wish. They have freedom of choice in accordance with the law. But as children, they are recognised as their biological sex.
Very helpful, thank you. And Helen, I think Christian Concern is another great organisation like Voice for Justice UK, and written an interesting article on what a new Labour government means for Christian freedoms. So this I'm going to directly quote from them, and which they say, one area of serious concern and a threat to Christian freedoms in the UK from a Labour government has been highlighted by Christian Concern, and that is in cancelling anyone who is unsure about their sexual identity or their gender and what comes out regarding their lifestyle, and anyone getting alongside them to provide counselling could face criminal prosecutions if found guilty under a Labour government. And also Labour has mentioned this in their election manifesto. So share your thoughts on how Labour, if they implement their election manifesto, we could see that this could have a huge impact on Christian counsellors who take their guidance, moral guidance from the Bible and Scripture, who are advising young people because they've come to them for advice, could find that they have criminal convictions hanging over their head, even worse criminal prosecutions they might face in this whole area. So share with us how this could be a major threat in terms of our Christian freedoms in this country.
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's good to dive straight into what the manifesto says, first of all. So I think this is on page 68. It says, Labour will protect LGBT plus and disabled people by making all existing strands of hate crime an aggravated offence. So-called conversion therapy is abuse. There is no other word for it. So Labour will finally deliver a full trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices while protecting the freedom for people to explore their sexual orientation and gender identity. We will also modernise, simplify and reform the intrusive and outdated gender recognition law to a new process. We will remove indignities for trans people who deserve recognition and acceptance whilst retaining the need for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria from a specialist doctor, enabling access to the healthcare pathway. And a little bit further on it says we will continue to support the implementation of its single-sex exceptions. Now, it seems like they want to sort of include everybody and not leave anybody out. So they want full trans-inclusive conversion therapy ban, but the freedom to explore sexually, to remove the indignities for recognition of trans people, but to retain the need for gender dysphoria and diagnosis and single-sex exceptions. It really shows to me very weak leadership that they can't actually have a straightforward understanding which is based on the science. It seems everybody can do what they want. You know, it's like everybody has got their own idea and it's okay to do what's right in their own eyes. And the Cass report actually spelled out the consequences. We had the Cass report not long ago, and there was a cross-party agreement that this would be taken very seriously. And even the bill that was going through called the conversion therapy bill was actually stalled because of very, very vague wording, and they couldn't actually pin down a proper meaning for what it was. And so it basically would have swept up everybody from parents, grandparents, pastors, praying, but also you could be the idea of an aggravated hate crime. Really, aggravated crime could be, for example, for race or religion. It's a very serious, it gets tougher penalties. So that, to imagine that would be placed on a grandfather who was sort of saying, you know, I'm not sure this is a good idea. It could be a very, very serious breach of our Christian freedoms. And interestingly, just talking about the RSE, on page 68, they have something else here. It talks about misogyny. It says, word for word, misogyny is one root cause, and therefore Labour will ensure schools address misogyny and teach young people about healthy relationships and consent. Now, you notice the word commitment does not come up anywhere in the RSE policies or worksheets. So the reason why we've got to the place we have is because they're teaching about consent and condoms. They're not actually talking about commitment. So it's almost like the Labour and Lib Dem coalition, if you want to call it like that, is it basically missing these important fundamental understandings of the root causes of some of these problems. It goes on the same page to talk about they want to strengthen the rights and protections available to women in cohabitating couples. So they recognise that cohabitating couples are more insecure and more at risk, but they don't think of actually sort of incentivising committed relationships.
Which is marriage, yeah. That was a very good analysis, and of course anyone wanting to know further about these proposals, you can always refer to the Labour website and have a look at their election manifesto for 2024. I suppose the big area of concern with this one, Robert, is the whole issue and the role played by Christian counsellors. So all it needs is for someone, for example, to not be genuine in wanting to seek help. That goes into the press, report it to one of the liberal progressive newspapers. Before you know it, this becomes a hot political issue, and we find then that criminal prosecutions are being brought against Christians. But surely this is up to the individual to decide what they want to do, and if they want to get help, they can get help. Once you start to go down that road, it almost seems as if this is an authoritarian direction that we could see Labour take if they implement their election manifesto.
It's interesting, isn't it? There isn't a legal ban on this sort of counselling or therapy connected to sexual orientation, but there is a kind of de facto ban in the sense that the mental health organisations in this country have been heavily persuaded by certain interest groups, and they have put out these position statements advising their accredited members not to actually support people with these sorts of values. What we need to really, I suppose, understand is when people who are in these situations are talking about their experiences, they often say that they want to explore with a counsellor or a therapist or with their parents if they're younger, identity issues relating to belonging, maybe trauma issues, maybe sexual abuse issues, and they should have that freedom to discuss those issues within that confidential room in accordance with their values. That's what they're saying. In the same way that someone who identifies as gay or lesbian, they have the freedom within our society to discuss their issues in accordance with their values. So Christians are saying, who may be affected by these issues, why can't that same principle work for them? It's interesting because in Malta, there's a case that's been going on for a few years of great concern. There's a man called Matthew Gretsch who's quite public about his own personal Christian testimony. He identifies as ex-gay, and the authorities are pursuing him. He's facing a trial, and he faces the possibility of a jail sentence merely for talking about his testimony, which, this is going to shock many, many Christians. So in the context of what is happening in this country and the kinds of bills that have gone through Parliament, it's felt by many commentators and legal analysts that it would catch possibly prayer and certainly or very likely consensual conversations between parents and their children or counsellors. Now this is a very dangerous territory because perhaps one final point I want to make is that, until the 1960s, we all accept that, people who identified then, to use the old language, as homosexual, they were persecuted. They often felt they were treated as second-class citizens. Now that's all changed. However, for this other population who are same-sex attracted, they may not take on these cultural labels of gay or lesbian. Many of them choose not to. And they are now being persecuted. They are being sidelined. They're not being recognised as a population in their own right by the mental health profession. So that raises very serious concerns about freedom of speech, freedom to receive healthcare, and freedom of conscience and freedom of religion.
Great, thank you. Only down to the last 4 minutes of the programme. So Helen, I need to bring in another aspect of serious concern that was mentioned in the Labour Party manifesto, and that is that the Labour Party have formally adopted the all-party parliamentary group's definition of Islamophobia that effectively prevents any criticism of Islamic beliefs or practices. Share with us how this is an encroachment on civil liberties and an encroachment on our Christian freedoms.
Yes, it's interesting. The Islamophobia wording is not actually in the manifesto, but it is in the Labour Party policy. It's in the Labour Party policy. And this was all about defining the meaning of what Islamophobia means. And you're absolutely right that there were some restrictions on what you were allowed to say, what you weren't allowed to say about it. If I can just read out what it actually says, the Islamophobia policy wording, where they specifically defined what they meant by that in 2018. Islamophobia is rooted in racism. It's a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness, perceived Muslimness. So, and most political parties adopted it in their policies, but it's not actually part of the manifesto as such, but it's basically the same thing, really. Many councils also adopted this. The trouble is, we already have an anti-Muslim hate law, so we don't really need it. This one, the Islamophobia, is open to personal interpretations of definition. So it basically, it could be very much abused in the same way as a blasphemy law is abused. If somebody, we saw what happened to Spiby in Pakistan, they used the wording and really it ended up with her being thrown into prison. But for example, if you want to criticise Islam, it could be that you don't agree with some of the women's rights that are or the lack of women's rights. It could be that you don't agree with some of their principles, and anything from dress to polygamy. You wouldn't actually be allowed to criticise it. So it's an absolute restriction on our liberty and also for the good sense of our society and empathy.
And Robert, obviously with the danger is that Christian Concern have warned this is effectively bringing about a blasphemy law through the deception of talking about Islamophobia. Now, to target anyone for their religion or for their race or their nation or their ethnicity is wrong. But also as part of a democracy, we have the right to scrutinise our own faith, Christianity, and the workings and the practice of that by the churches. So therefore, it's also important to address one of the topic issues, and that is Jew hatred within the Islamic society community that needs to be addressed. And of course, this new law would effectively make that illegal and give the Islamists immunity. Within 30 seconds, we'll have to close.
Look, we used to have a blasphemy law against Christianity. That was repealed in 2008. I think we have now a kind of de facto blasphemy law when it comes to freely discussing Islam within the context of religion generally. And it's a sad state of affairs if we can't have that free and healthy discussion.
Absolutely. So, Robert and Helen, thank you so much. Done a great job. Really appreciate your insights and your expertise and giving us an understanding of where our Christian freedoms could be challenged with this new Labour government. And I want to thank you for watching this programme at home. As Christians, I think we need to pray for this new government. We need to be vigilant. We need to scrutinise their policies to see where this has a direct impact on our Christian freedoms. And we need to stand up and value the freedoms that we have in this country. And so thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.